In this code demonstration, we're going to take a look at the difference between the $apply and $digest functions in AngularJS. Now, in order to make use of this demo, you have to make sure that you include AngularJS in your web page. I have done so here from a very popular CDN, but you can also download a copy of Angular to your local web application and reference it from there. Now, scrolling down here a little bit, let's take a little bit of a look at our Angular application. We have ngapp with set to the value of myapp, and then we have a message here, or a template variable, set on our root scope, and then we have ngController pointing to myControl, and we have a child message template variable within ngController scope. So scrolling down to our JavaScript code, we're going to see where we've defined our myapp module and we've defined myController. Now we're going to be injecting both the root scope and the $scope, which represents the scope for this controller. Now you'll notice here we're going to set $root scope root message set to initial root message, and $scope child message to initial child message. So this is going to populate the root message variable with initial root message and the child message with initial child message. So now if we switch over to our web browser and we reload our page, we'll see that we have initial root message and initial child message. Now, the difference we'd like to take a look at in terms of apply versus digest is we want to understand from which scope object they actually operate. So down here I've created a setTimeout function that is going to execute after 2 seconds. Now I've intentionally not used the timeout service because I actually want to invoke apply and digest myself so that I can kind of compare the difference between the two of them. You can see here I have a console.log timeout expired, so that regardless of what happens, after 2 seconds we can actually see that the timeout in fact has expired. And then you can see here where I've set a new root message and a new child message. So if we actually don't call apply at all or digest, and we simply run the timeout, let's observe what happens. If we reload the page, we're going to observe that after 2 seconds our timeout has expired, but our messages have not been updated. And that's because the digest loop has not been executed to actually synchronize the values on the scope with the values displayed in the UI. So now let's call the apply function. Let's observe what happens. When we call the apply function like this, and we go back to our web page and reload, if we wait the 2 seconds, we'll notice that now we have a new root message and a new child message. So the timeout service actually does all of this with apply for us, but because we're using setTimeout, we're calling apply manually, which then causes the digest loop to trigger, and the values on the scope get synchronized with the view, and we actually see the new root message and the new child message. Now what's interesting is we actually called $apply from the child scope of ngController. We did not call this from the root scope. Nevertheless, the new root message was in fact updated. However, what happens if we call this with digest? If we call this with digest like this, and then go back here and reload the page, observe what happens. Notice the timeout has expired, but only the new child message has been updated. Now, if we were to examine the scope object, we would see that both of these properties were in fact updated, but only the new child message was reflected in the UI. And that's because the difference between $apply and $digest is this. When you call $scope.$digest, it only runs the digest loop, that synchronization process, from that particular scope and all of its children. However, when you call $apply, what that does is that actually uses the root scope and begins the digest from the root scope and does all of the scopes in the application. So, when should you choose to use one over the other? If you have a lot of scope objects on your page, and you have a lot of watches, and you have a lot of observes, then in situations where you know you're only modifying one particular scope object, probably further on down the hierarchy of scopes, instead of calling apply and running the digest loop for all of the scope objects, which would take a while, just in terms of doing the watch comparison functions would take a while, you can actually choose to simply call the digest function on one of those lower level scopes, and then it will only do the digest loop process for that scope and all of its children, meaning that only the watch functions for that part of the scope tree will be executed. And for larger pages, this can definitely help make your application more performant.